Yes, here I am in Spain, España. ¿Cómo estás? Yes. Buenos días. I'm here for the first day for the COP, for me anyway, not the first day I was at COP. First day at the COP for me. My second COP, all right, now policía, okay? And so this is different. This is the Council of Parties with the United Nations. And so y'all see the sun has not yet fully risen, but I'm on my way this chilly morning to head on over and fight climate change. So, give you a little bit more insights as we journey. Peace. Paz. Oh, beautiful. Look at the rainbow. Gorgeous. Great sign.
It is a good sign.
Yes. Yeah, great sign.
I'm here.
Yeah. ¿Cómo estás? So, la reina Queen, they go to Geechee. How many children do? This year the Queen Quet coming from España, from Spain, from Madrid, from the UN COP25. And so it is a blessing. I want to thank all of you who helped to send me to this event to represent us for climate change, because you know that this is a dynamic that we are definitely on the front lines of, or as I like to say, on the front shorelines of. So, honey chiller, you go and take a little bit of journey with me and things like that. See what we to do right here, because it's truly time for action. So this is not just about ambition, but let's take that ambition and put some actions behind it. So, honey chiller, you know if honey day with me, honey go I know disya, they go going on.
Closing thoughts on mobilising the arts, culture and heritage for climate action, and if there's time we'll have an opportunity for a short Q&A. Well, the Climate Heritage Network has come a long way in a very short time, but several hundred people have come together and participated in the formation of this network, starting at the Climate Heritage Mobilisation event at the Global Action Summit held in San Francisco in September 2018. And it's amazing to think that's only 15 months ago. This year, over 200 participants helped refine our action plan during the network's global launch event, hosted by my own organisation, Historic Environment Scotland, in Edinburgh in October, where over 70 arts, culture and heritage organisations from around the world signed up and committed to emphasising the role that arts, culture and heritage can play in achieving the ambitions of the Paris Agreement. From my own perspective, I am immensely excited by the potential that exists in this network. At Historic Environment Scotland, we have had a climate change programme now for almost 10 years. We're into our second generation carbon management programme. We've made great progress over that time. We're now producing our second generation climate action plan. And our progress has been great. We've cut our carbon emissions by over 25%. We've developed an ambitious climate risk assessment methodology for the historic environment in Scotland, and we've worked with the wider heritage and historic environment sector to raise awareness and support good decision making. But we realise that is not enough. We now need more action, and we need it faster. In short, we have to raise our game. And we need to work together to do this, to share our knowledge and our experiences and to learn from others. And that is exactly what our action plan is about. Each of the activities you'll hear about this morning are there to generate resources to allow us to push the boundaries further. Our membership and our sector is diverse, and we all have a duty to put our own houses in order in terms of emission reduction, in terms of adaptation and resilience, and engaging with the wider sustainability agenda. But we also have a duty as a sector to play a wider role and to drive change beyond our own boundaries. One of the things that struck me at the network launch event was the determination that cultural heritage should not become a victim of climate change, but rather we can flip this around and become a vector for change. We need to harness the immense knowledge from culture and heritage and to bring our perspective to centre stage to support wider climate action. I've been at the COP now for a couple of days and I've sat in on some amazing and inspiring events. But one thing that struck me at several of these has been the emphasis on data, on technology, on innovation, on measuring and modelling. And that's fine and that's essential, and I'm a scientist, that's great with me. But sometimes I've felt we're missing the human dimension. I was at a great meeting yesterday morning on the ambitions of global cities, and it was only really in the discussion that we heard about putting people at the centre. And what is required is actually a cultural transformation. We exist in cultural ecosystems, and those of us involved in culture, heritage and the arts have a crucial role to play in supporting the changes that need to happen. Andrew Potts, our coordinator, has said many times that cultural heritage has an immense potential to drive climate action and to support transitions by communities towards climate resilient futures, but that potential often goes untapped. So this morning we're here to change that. So on with our event. Before we hear about the action plan, I'd like to introduce two speakers who are representing very different parts of the cultural heritage world to share with us their thoughts on how cultural heritage can drive climate action and to give us their perspective on why they think a global heritage network is necessary. So first up, I'd like to introduce Queen Quet, who's Chieftess of the Gullah Geechee Nation, to speak on her perspective of why cultural climate action is important. Queen Quet. About the action plan, I'd like to introduce two speakers who are representing very different parts of the cultural heritage world to share with us their thoughts on how cultural heritage can drive climate action and to give us their perspective on why they think a global heritage network is necessary. So first up, I'd like to introduce Queen Quet, who's Chieftess of the Gullah Geechee Nation, to speak on her perspective of why cultural climate action is important. Queen Quet.
Work together, children, don't you get weary. Great camp meeting in the promised land. We go and work and never get tired. Work and never get tired. Work and never get tired. Great camp meeting in the promised land. Morning, how all the children to do? We're glad for see on the day. We're so glad for being this part of the world. We're on our way to the cracky teeth and say, hola, ¿cómo estás? Huh? Hola. Muy bien, muy bien. We're glad for there. From where across the water and things like that. Where we done did in the Atlantic Ocean and things like that. So you know such a thing say, the country there over here, the water there over here, the land there over here, all of this shit, they we don't want the order that. So and then yet is this year, well, sea level begin to rise. First the week, that don't make no sense. Because this thing happen every day. Two down there, they go up like a this shit, and they go down like a this shit. So first we had the people that crack it like that, we said, that's like how around they do now when you hear them crack it. So, right, like I said, you're looking at me the same way we looked at you when you all came up with this term, sea level rise. Because I live in the Atlantic Ocean, on the Sea Islands, from Jacksonville, North Carolina to Jacksonville, Florida, off the coast of the United States, is the Gullah Geechee Nation. So honey, you had to be the crack with tea like this, anything like that. That's my home language, which is Gullah. And so in Gullah, understand, what did you all mean by sea level rise? Because living on islands, the sea rises every day for us, twice a day. We have high tide, we have low tide. Someone said, what is people that they're talking about something that already exists? To us as people indigenous to the coastline, we couldn't get where you all were coming from. And then we finally realized, you all finally found words for what we had been seeing, what we had been talking about, what we had witnessed for over 2 or 3 decades already. But when we said that our culture is inextricably tied to the land, there is no difference between me, then the water, and then the land. We're all one. No one in the political offices got what we were saying. In fact, they said that we were the emotional natives. And so I was happy to meet some people who thought that the emotions of the natives was valuable, that they actually value a word we value, culture. They valued another word that we value, community, because to us, it unifies you, that which you have in common. And so, our thing was finding this commonality with this new network that was from around the world, of other people who don't crack a teeth like Alicia tall, like one or two of them look at me the snout and thing like that, and like, when? Right? Like y'all were looking at me a while ago wondering, will she stop doing that? What's going on right now? Right? We were looking at the rest of the world the same way. Would they stop the actions they're doing right now that are having the kind of impact on our coast that we're seeing? And then slowly, I'm a computer scientist, so slowly people started getting programmed enough to start dialoguing in a way that we did understand and understand what they were saying, and they understood and understood what we were saying as well, because now we had in common this thing called climate change. And again, we're the ones that need to change with the climate, is what we saw. And we again couldn't get it as to why the Western world didn't know what that was. And then they said to us, there's a couple of terms we use. They're called resilience and adaptation. And again, in Gullah, we don't have those words. So I had to figure out, what did they mean by those? And then I found out we're the embodiment of resilience, because for over 400 years on the Sea Islands, we have had to shift and change, because why? We're in a hurricane zone. So you talk about something you can't really predict is going to happen. Wow. How do you remain there in the face of all of that? Prior to the Weather Channel, my ancestors did it. So there's no way we can't do it now, you see. But every time we said, we have something we can offer you. There's something we'd like to talk to you about. There's something that we live that we think you all should learn from, that you could use. People said, here we go, the emotional natives again. We don't do it that way. Could you write it? In fact, would you do a PowerPoint presentation? I said the power is for us to make the point in our own language, in our own tradition, in our own culture, and on the coast, so you can see what we see. And then maybe we'll have community, because we'll unify together over this common thing that we all can reverse. If we all caused it, then if we all come together, we should all be able to defeat it. And so here came this new network saying, well, you know what? I think you all have a point. I think the other indigenous people of the world have a point. I think the other coastal people of the world have a point. You all live on the front lines, and I like to say on the front shoreline of these changes. So your TK, and I was like, and what's that an abbreviation for? Your traditional knowledge means something. It's valuable. I said, wow, you think? I said, it took you a little while to figure that one out, huh? And they said, yes, but we got it now. Would you come and talk to us? And at first, because everything in the Western world is linear, like how these seats are in rows, we didn't want to enter that, because everything in my world is circular, like these tables here. And we like to sit in the circle. The same way our cast nets go out into the ocean, they become circles, and then they go down and they lift up that which nurtures the spirit. We didn't see that same thing coming through the lines, and we were lining up to do the next wrong thing on our coast. We wanted them to enter our circle. Said we could have cracked a teeth with one another, thing like that, and now put a few things while we were doing. So we could eat and talk and learn from one another in that circle. So when this network said, why don't you join us? Why don't you be a part of it? We're gonna take action at the Global Climate Action Summit. I said, now you're talking. Because I don't like just a bunch of talking. The Western world loves talking, y'all love writing, y'all love death by PowerPoint. I said, but if we're gonna do something, I'll be there. And I was in San Francisco. And they said, next, we're going to the COP. I said, you know, us and COPs don't get along that well. What you talking about exactly? They said, no, COP 25. I said, okay, I'll be there. And I'm here, and I'm honored to be here with other people of the world who have the same type of passion for what we're fighting for here. That just like in the Gullah Geechee Nation's flag, you see that the tree is in the center. But do you see what that tree is made of? What is it? Anybody? Can y'all tell? What's the tree made of? What? People, exactly. Right, people. Our tree is a family tree. It's made of people. It's rooted in our coastline. It represents the Igbo, Mandinka, Malinke, Yuliba, Gullah, Geechee, Mendi, Temni, Fik, Ibibio, Yamasi, Kusako, Kree. The people who make up who I am. As I said, who we be Gullah Geechee, anointed people. The blue represents the water as well as the indigo that my ancestors were enslaved to grow. The green represents the land, and the gold represents the Carolina gold rice that we grew by the tons, but it also represents the sun, the brighter day, and what they called us black gold. So knowing that richness and knowing that that richness now has value to another group, that our TK is what we can invest in this new network, I said, I'm there and I'm going to be a part of the Climate Heritage Mobilization Network because they value me, they value community, they value culture. And that's the kind of change in the climate of discussions about resiliency and adaptation that we need. And so I definitely will be a part of those discussions, be a part of that work, and be a part of that journey. And I just thought it a blessing to see the action plan because one of my favorite numbers is the number 7. And that's because the number 7 is one level of completion of a septenary. And there were 7 points out of 8 that we're already doing in the Gullah Geechee Nation. So hopefully in our dialogue at the end of our session, we'll be able to crack the teeth with one about a little bit more about that and things like that and what we're going to do, where I to be. And so in the meantime, those who joined with us to work in collaboration, we came up with this anthology called We Be Gullah Geechee, Cultural Capital and Collaboration, so that we could work with universities and scientists and politicians and others who usually come in and look at us as a specimen, and we become part of this slideshow, would know how to do research in our community in a respectful manner, and that they would know what we value, even when our voices couldn't be there or they couldn't come into our circle, that these words could go around the world like I've done to do here today. So thank you for having me, and I pray that we all become one huge global community with climate heritage mobilized. Peace and blessings, everybody.
Thank you very much. Fantastic start to our event. Can I next introduce Sarah Sutton, who's principal. Sarah is principal of Sustainable Museums, and she's also cultural sector lead for the We Are Still in Coalition. Sarah.
So I think Andrew owes me a bottle of wine for making me follow Queen Quet. And if I hadn't seen her before in the Keeping History Above Water programs, I would have probably left. But I've enjoyed her presentations before, and I was delighted to see her here today. So you'll notice I don't look anything like her, and I'm going to give you a PowerPoint. So I'm here to talk to you about the U.S. cultural sector. So that's zoos, gardens, museums, historic sites, aquariums. There are 35,000 of us. We have 850 million visitors who come and see our organizations. Why the U.S. cultural sector? It's because of the impact, the real and potential impact. We know that the single most important step for any individual is to talk about climate change. Talking about it normalizes it. It normalizes having the conversations. It raises awareness, and it calls others to consider the issues in their own actions. If museums, one of the most trusted sites in the U.S., doesn't talk about this stuff, then how can we expect anyone else to? And if we don't do it, how can we talk about it? So imagine all of the parking decks and the access loops and the rooftops and all of the exhibits and all of the pathways and animal habitats and energy systems and all those things that go into our institutions. We can consider those ecosystem resources in the climate change battle. And imagine all of the community partnerships, the educational exhibits, the programs, and all of those planning meetings that can take place in museums that uplift this discourse, strengthen commitments, and launch cooperative action. And that's what I'm here to talk to you today about, is cooperative action. So, what is the connection? What is the relationship between cultural institutions and climate change? So museums have these awesome tools for understanding climate change. They have skills, the staff have skills and settings for engaging in public and climate action. The museum goers are more likely to be concerned about climate change and to choose to take action than the rest of the U.S. public sector. But there's a problem with this. The people who are most concerned, most interested, are also the ones most likely to feel anxiety, fear, or depression about it, all of which is paralyzing. But these are the folks we need to take action. So what do we know about climate change? It's complex, it's a system, it's a complex system, and it demands system-level responses, collective action. So climate change is accelerating far too fast for individual interventions alone, and somehow we've got to figure out how to coordinate and scale this faster. And that's where the two come together. Collective action is the most effective tool for combating climate fears and anxieties, and it's what accelerates action and scales it closer to the rate we need. So collective action equals climate hope at every single level. And I can tell you that this summer I had a class of students taking a master's course in social responsibility of environmental sustainability in museums. And every single student was experiencing climate anxiety and distress to the point where I had to change my syllabus in order to have an intervention class for them. They were telling me that they were not saving for retirement, and they weren't even serious about paying off their school loans. So we had pretty much a class shut down, and we had to start all over again. In the evaluations, they said one of the coolest things about the class was the discussion about climate grief. And having that discussion together and coming up with work we wanted to do together was helpful in getting them through that phase. So now I want to tell you about We Are Still In. So in the summer of 2017, I was living in Hawaii, and I heard that the United States was stepping out of the Paris Agreement. It's one of those moments where you will always know where you were on that day, what you were doing. I was on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at my home office, which was under an avocado tree, and I felt like I'd been abandoned by my country. There was something, could I, I'm like thinking about Canada, because could I remain in a country that didn't share my values? And then I sort of calmed down and I realized that all of us who believe in this work would do it anyway, that we would go ahead. So I made some phone calls to peers and colleagues and clients, and I ended up with 10 folks who agreed with me. And I invented the hashtag Museums for Paris, and then I realized that pretty much this was going to get bigger than me, bigger than sustainable museums and my avocado tree. We were going to have to do something a little more complex about it. And then in 2018, we are still in, well, in 2017, we are still in was born. So this was a coalition of, so nobody told me that they're not advancing? There we go. Got it? All right. So 3,800 institutions are all currently signatories to We Are Still In. That's the different type of breakout that we have as our sections now. But when this started, they didn't have a cultural institution sector, they didn't have faith-based, they didn't have health institutions. So we started knocking on the door, and in 2018 they invited the museum sector to join as the cultural institution sector. So why does that matter? Let me tell you a little bit about who's in. So these are some of the 70 organizations that we've got part of it now. You'll see that it's a wide variety all over the United States, middle of the states, both sides of the state, coast, urban, rural. 27 of those are cultural heritage institutions. So it's not just the science centers, it's not just the art museums. Oops, missed one slide. Okay, so the special value of cultural institutions to We Are Still In. This is what we make the difference for them. Because we can connect all of the investors, we can connect the folks who are the business investors, the businesses, the organizations who are part of the health systems, we can do the mayors and the city governors, all those folks who are interested in having a connection with the public, we are the pathway for them doing that. So the idea is that this sort of cooperative network is the kind of thing that is turned into the Heritage Network on a larger scale that's international. That's why Sustainable Museums supports it, and why we're going to keep continuing to do that work. So I want you to take away two things. A big part of this section is cultural heritage sector supporting the Climate Heritage Network. And the other message is that the United States and all of the cultural institutions are still supporting the Paris Agreement, and we do it better together. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And that's our first two presentations, really to give you a sense of the flavour and the diversity of our sector and the sort of organisations and ideas and potential that we're bringing together to harness under cultural heritage and the arts and the Climate Heritage Network. What we want to do now is to move on to talk about our action plan. So can I introduce the Climate Heritage Network's coordinator, Andrew Potts, who's going to lead this session. Andrew.
Thank you, Ewan. Well, the PowerPoint's coming up. I'll just say that I happen to be from the United States, and so to Sarah Sutton and the people that we're still in, you're making me proud. Also recognize Stephanie Shapiro from the American Association of Museums, who's in the audience. Perfect, thank you. So I have a really plum assignment here today. I have the honor of breaking some news, of releasing the initial action plan of the Climate Heritage Network, the Madrid to Glasgow Arts, Culture and Heritage Climate Action Plan. So the embargo is lifted. I know it's been hotly awaited, and here it is. Some of you were in New York City in September for the UN Climate Action Summit. And in advance of that, Secretary General Guterres told the participants, don't come to New York with speeches, come with plans. And so I want it to be heard throughout the halls of COP25 that the arts, culture, and heritage sectors have come to Madrid with plans, not just speeches. So we're here with a plan exactly as Secretary General Guterres asked us to do. What I'm going to do now is walk you through that plan. It has 8 activities in it. Each of the activities is being spearheaded by one of the network members. Some of those network members who are spearheading activities are in the room. So I'm going to quickly walk you through all 8 of the activities, but I'm going to, after I speak, then I'm going to call up 3 of the activity coordinators who will talk in a little more detail about that particular project. I'll talk a little bit more about the others. I think the previous speakers have already given you a pretty good background on the genesis of this plan. Suffice to say that climate change is an anthropogenic problem, means caused by people. Not caused by people individually, but caused by people in society, working through the consumption and production patterns consistent with their culture. Climate change is a cultural problem. Climate change affects people, but it doesn't just affect people in isolation, it affects communities, it affects territories, so it affects cultural systems. So climate change is caused by culture, and climate change is affecting culture. So climate change is a culture problem. That being said, and somewhat surprisingly, the people that work day in and day out in culture are often not at the table of climate action. Social science and the learning of communities and from culture often not valorized in climate science processes. I personally would suggest that the ambition gap that we see in climate action is not unrelated to the failure to foreground the cultural dimensions of climate change. And so the founding idea of the Climate Heritage Network is to flip that paradigm, exactly as Ewan said. And this action plan represents our down payment on that objective. What are the gaps? What are the reasons? What explains the lack of a foregrounding of the cultural dimensions of climate change? And how can we in the arts, culture, and heritage sector foreground the cultural dimensions and mobilize our sectors for climate action? So now to walk you through the 8 activities that make up the plan. The first activity, using culture to communicate about climate action. You use the word vector, and I like that a lot. Culture is a vector that can drive climate action, and we want to explore the modalities and techniques of that and put that information in the hands of every cultural actor in the world. To lead this project, we have ICON, it's the Institute of Conservation, a UK-based NGO. And so ICON and a team of partners from around the world, network members, will be spearheading this action number 1, connecting to the topic of high ambition and building capacity to act on climate, which is so important under the Paris Agreement. Activity number 2. You heard a little bit about this already. Valuing traditional knowledge. How do we make the case for valuing traditional knowledge as climate technology? Or to use the words of the Paris Agreement, endogenous capacities. I think Queen Quet already spoke more powerfully than I can about the role of traditional knowledge, the role of culture and communities. How do we get that valued? Not just instrumentally as something that can be appropriated, but intrinsically as a key to climate action. And that's what this activity will focus on. The activity is going to be coordinated by a couple institutions. First, INTAC, the Indian Trust for Arts and Cultural Heritage in India, also the University of California at San Diego, and the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. So that's activity number 2. The third activity of the 8 activities in our Madrid to Glasgow Arts, Culture, and Heritage Climate Action Plan takes us to the genesis of climate change, and that is greenhouse gas emissions. What is the role of the historic built environment in getting us to net zero? This plan is about making the case for building reuse as a key tool to decarbonizing the building sector. In many countries, we already have the majority of the buildings today that we will have in 2030. So the road to decarbonizing the built environment is through existing buildings. It's a tremendous repository of knowledge on how to work with existing and older buildings in the cultural heritage community, not adequately tapped for decarbonization, nor is the role of embodied and avoided carbon valued in many greenhouse gas protocols. And so this initiative, co-led by the state of California, Office of Historic Preservation, and another network called the Zero Net Carbon Collaborative for Existing and Historic Buildings, along with partners around the world, including the American Institute of Architects, will tackle this question of making the case for building reuse as a key strategy for carbon mitigation. The next item in the action plan has to do with mainstreaming culture into climate planning. I think there's no better proof for the proposition that culture has not been foregrounded in climate action than the fact that very few climate adaptation frameworks, national climate strategies, regional climate strategies, local climate plans seriously mention arts, culture, or heritage. The cultural dimension is often missing from those plans. And so this activity, which will be led by my own organization, ECOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, will look at changing that. How do we get culture into action plans? Or really put another way, how do we make those action plans fit for purpose? Because I believe that a climate action plan, especially an adaptation plan, that fails to mention the cultural dimensions of climate change is not calibrated to succeed as well as it could be. And so this is about making climate action more effective. Next one. Using culture to promote climate resilient sustainable development. So even as the world is aspiring to decarbonize consistent with the Paris Agreement, it's also aspiring to develop sustainably as guided by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Culture is fairly well expressed in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, not the least of which in Goal 11.4, which connects the safeguarding of cultural heritage to urban resilience, sustainability, inclusiveness, and safety. I think we all know that not everything that occurs under the rubric of sustainable development is also consistent with decarbonization. And in the culture sector, we see that nowhere more potently than on the topic of tourism. Cultural tourism is the fastest growing sector of tourism. Tourism delivers enormous benefits, but it has an obvious downside, particularly its greenhouse gas emissions. And so this initiative will look at merging the Sustainable Development Agenda and the Paris Agenda in the context of culture. It will be led by United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG, their Culture Committee, and the Culture 2030 Network that was formed many years ago as part of the Rio Plus 20 process to mainstream culture into the Sustainable Development Agenda. The next activity in the action plan, coordinating cultural heritage safeguarding and climate action. Culture is a common good. Culture is a public asset. It's a value for communities. Conserving culture and climate action often are closely aligned, but realizing that co-benefit is improved if there's proper planning. And sometimes there's tension between customary approaches to safeguarding cultural heritage, particularly built heritage and climate action, as for example, when there is tension over the siting of wind farms in cultural landscapes. So how do we avoid those conflicts? How do we facilitate achieving the co-benefit of conserving cultural value and achieving climate action together? This is a project that will be led by UN Habitat, and I'm glad we have Marcus Mayer here from UN Habitat who will talk a little bit more about that. I said at the outset that culture has not consistently been at the table in climate action and climate science. And what would have been more accurate to have said is that but for indigenous peoples, culture has not been consistently at the table of climate action, because indigenous peoples have foregrounded the issue of cultural survival from the beginning in their engagement in these processes. And so it's, I think, axiomatic that supporting indigenous peoples is climate action. And I would go a little further and say supporting indigenous peoples is a strategy for foregrounding culture in the climate change conversation. And so a top strategy that we immediately wanted to pursue was how we, as the culture sector broadly construed around the world, can amplify the work of indigenous peoples. It's a fortuitous moment with the embracement yesterday of the 2-year action plan of the facilitated working group of the local communities indigenous peoples platform at the UNFCCC, and so top strategy of ours and activity will be amplifying that work. And we're lucky to have Janine Yazzie from the International Indian Treaty Council to talk about that project. So we call the plan the Madrid to Glasgow Action Plan, and that's for an obvious reason. We're trying to act with urgency, and so we have designed activities that can deliver results immediately, and we intend to reconvene in 2020 in Glasgow to report on the results. I hope you will join us for that. It's not so easy, though, to get the cultural heritage sector at a COP, in the COP, because we haven't been at the table. The participants you see here, assembling them, is an unprecedented gesture by the arts, cultural, and heritage community. So we will start now to bring more voices to foreground the cultural dimension of climate action into the climate conversation in general, and specifically to Glasgow. And so that involves capacity building, and this initiative, our 8th activity under the action plan to build the arts, culture, and heritage constituency, will be co-led by the 2 co-chairs of the network, which, as you've heard, is Historic Environment Scotland and the State of California Office of Historic Preservation. So collectively, those 8 activities represent the Madrid to Glasgow Action Plan. It's our down payment on realizing the potential of cultural heritage to close the ambition gap, close the emissions gap, and to mobilize the arts, cultural, and heritage community for climate action. We're taking action, you're taking action, we'd like to take action together. If there's not an arts, culture, or heritage constituent in your work, talk to us, find one, we want to be your partner. So it's been my pleasure to release the Madrid to Glasgow Arts, Cultural, and Heritage Climate Action Plan. And if you wouldn't mind giving a round of applause for all of the actors who spent the last year developing it, for us it's enormously exciting. We're lucky to have 3 institutions in the room that are involved in implementing the plan, and I want to invite them up one by one to talk a little bit more about their own work. I'm going to start with activity 2, which you'll remember is valuing traditional knowledge. And to speak to that, we're happy to have with us a member of the Climate Heritage Network Steering Committee and one of the leads in undertaking that action, Historic England, in the person of Dr. Hannah Fluck, who is the head of environmental strategy for Historic England. So Hannah, if you wouldn't mind taking the podium.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and looking forward to being able to be involved in COP in our own country in a year's time, and welcoming many of you there. Now I'm going to talk about valuing traditional knowledge. I'm also very aware that I am not in a position to speak for the Indigenous peoples and communities who you will also hear from and their traditional knowledge. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what this piece of work means to Historic England and to our work and to our interests in the traditional knowledge that we deal with. So I think I've missed off a few logos here. I had an early draft of the action plan, and I was trying to include all the partner organisations that will be involved in this activity. The important thing to note is that this is about information, gathering examples of information about sustainable traditional practices. And one of the points that I've highlighted there is grouping them by climate zone. Now, as our climates change, our own traditional knowledge and experiences may not be those that are most suited to the climates that we're facing in the future. And this is where having a truly global network becomes very powerful, because we can learn from others who might have cultural and traditional knowledge that relates to climates that we will be experiencing in the future. So sharing this globally is an extremely powerful part of this action. The other point that I've highlighted is how we value this knowledge. And this has been one of the challenges, both for me working within the UK and trying to engage with climate change policy within the UK, the way in which we experience the impacts of climate change upon our cultural heritage, and the way in which what we know and our traditional knowledge can be applied to adapting to and mitigating climate change often requires scientific papers, peer-reviewed publications, and things that are not very easily captured, metrics, the sorts of measurements and things that don't necessarily come easily to culture. So how we manage to value and communicate that to what is a very scientifically dominated community is one of those challenges that we've been facing, and I know others are too. So one of the ways in which we've been doing this in Historic England is by looking at how we can translate our traditional knowledge, in this instance of our built environment, our traditional building materials, which are inherently sustainable, often from earth, in the ground, right next to where you're building the house, and how we can translate our knowledge about the fact that these work. They're still standing hundreds of years later. There is no modern building that does that, that can guarantee that it will be standing in hundreds of years' time, but we can do that for our sustainable and our traditional buildings. And so my colleagues at Historic England have worked on laboratory research and reviews of how properties have recovered, in this instance particularly from flooding, that demonstrate that not only are these materials sustainable, but they are incredibly resilient to flood damage if well maintained. And this is something that I think others will also have perhaps a frustration around, how we can get what we know to be valuable information about preparing for the future into these more scientific contexts. It's also about more than just buildings. There's a particular focus on buildings. I think it's quite an obvious one, perhaps quite an easy place to start. But it's also about how we use the land. Our landscape and land use knowledge, plant knowledge. I sat in a session yesterday with Indigenous peoples talking about food security and food sovereignty. And it's incredibly important to understand the meaning of that knowledge within those cultures, that it's not just about the seeds and the plants and how you feed people, but it's embedded in so much more. But within that is incredible knowledge of the importance of the diversity of the food that we eat. And the ability of that to adapt to new conditions. Agricultural knowledge, and also place history. So I'm an archaeologist. I'm an archaeologist specialising in human evolution. I deal with deep time. And I think the time depth that archaeology and historical research can look at how things have changed through time. Those practices that worked or didn't work, often through many generations, rather than just looking at a very narrow window of time for now or within living memory. And in other cultures that have a strong oral history, there will be time depth within that as well, that gives that sense of how things have changed and how things are different, and how we can learn from that for the future. Finally, I always like to get Lego into these talks. I've got a colleague who came up with what I think is a brilliant analogy to looking at the approach that we have to cultural heritage sometimes, particularly in the UK. Hands up, who's seen the Lego movie? I like this bit.
Trailer.
Yeah. Oh, okay. It's very good if you haven't seen it. Anyway, the story goes that the main character is a creative type who will adapt the Lego bricks to any situation. And there's the dad figure who wields a tube of glue and likes to fix things just as they are. And I think that this is a great way to start to think about our cultural heritage. Our cultural heritage is our building blocks, and we don't fully understand yet the futures that we're going to be facing together. But if we take some time to really understand the cultural heritage, it gives us really strong building blocks that we can use to adapt together and change and learn from each other, to build a future where we can have a sustainable and healthy and happy existence. So I'm going to leave it on that and pass back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I think just from a couple speakers, and of course, Hannah, you will have seen the enormous amount of work that goes on in the fields of arts, culture, and heritage, dealing with traditional knowledge, and of course, among Indigenous peoples, Indigenous ways of knowing. There is, of course, an enormous technology transfer mechanism under the UNFCCC, dealing, among other things, with endogenous capacities, what the Paris Agreement refers to, meaning the things local people already know how to do. But I dare say there's virtually zero connectivity between them. And it highlights to me the urgent need to connect cultural workers to the processes of the UNFCCC. So we're going to move on now to another activity that I mentioned, and hear from another member of the network that is spearheading that particular activity. It's the one that has to do with coordinating cultural heritage safeguarding and planning. And to speak to that, it's my pleasure to invite up to the podium Marcus Mayer. Marcus is with the Urban Design and Planning Branch of UN Habitat in Nairobi. I think I won't keep saying over and over again, keep emphasizing how little connected we have felt to the processes of climate policy making. Suffice to say, it's been enormously valuable to have a shepherd, a guide, someone that can help us understand the labyrinth of agencies and entities in the UN, in and out of the UN system, and that shepherd for us has been UN Habitat. So Marcus, to you and your colleagues in Nairobi, thank you for that collaboration, and talk to us a little bit about the connection between urban and territorial planning, culture, and climate action.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you very much for inviting us today. We're extremely proud and extremely thankful for being here today. As one of the UN city agency, we're the agency UN Habitat, it's the Human Settlements Program, and we're particularly putting our focus on building more sustainable cities within the UN system. You know, probably as the cultural stakeholders, you know, UNESCO probably very good at looking after education and culture. But we as an agency, we're looking particularly at a territorial approach on cities. So first of all, I would like to explain a little bit why we are extremely proud to be part of that network. In a second step, just give you a flavor of what we're doing, and that's why also underlining why we think this network is useful for us for enriching our work. And three, just to summarize, to see what we believe is the value of a network like this and looking forward. So let me just start by saying that we believe culture is so far in our work was always a kind of a soft, undervalued asset that we always understood as having to do with being very relevant for a solution to urban problems, but at the same time being very hard to capture for us. So we have heard already today a little bit of what to do and how to do things and with whom to do it. I would like to focus my talk a little bit on the importance of also understanding where to do things. Everything has a very specific context relevance and a specific spatial context where things are happening. We're talking about cultural intervention, cities, or we're talking about culture and climate change, but it very much depends on where it takes place. We have heard about coastal communities on islands in a very vulnerable region of the world. You can think about highland places or dry places, desert places, Arctic places. So it always matters where things are done. And that is where urban and territorial planning, regional planning, we believe is going to be very important. And then we believe heritage is an untapped resource on understanding and improving climate action. At a very large territorial scale, you could see, traditional landscape, cultural landscape, offer a recipe to understand better and plan better climate action when you think about traditional landscapes, traditional water management systems in different parts of the world. When you then look one scale below, maybe at an urban and city scale, historically cities, and they were much smaller then, they have developed very historically, with the full appreciation of bioclimatic context, low energy solutions for transport, for food systems, for services, for delivering water, but not only a very energy efficient way of doing things, but also a very climate resilient way of doing things. We're hearing coastal cities that when you hear climate impacts, it's never the kind of the ancient center of the city that is affected. There's always these new, modern, unplanned developments that are suffering the most, because traditionally, with their traditional knowledge, with their heritage, people were able to live with the bioclimatic conditions. And then if you look maybe even one step down at the neighborhood scale, neighborhoods have been built to in a cultural, very sensitive way to the human scale, to cultural practices, to the way people are doing things. So, in very sophisticated way, again, developed a very, very clear, tangible tangible and intangible heritage that deals with climate change. And the last scale, maybe the building scale. People have been building buildings for generations according to the bioclimatic conditions surrounding them. But this kind of knowledge, indigenous knowledge, some people say, this kind of tradition and culture, this has been lost a little bit. Buildings are built in a uniform way, totally unconsiderate about the kind of settings they're developed in. And this is something that we always felt is an important component, but it has been very difficult for us to link up with people that know these things much better than we do, and also to articulate this in our planning processes and our services to cities and governments. So I just wanted to, maybe on the next point, move into 3 concrete examples where we in the past have been able to at least, scratch on the surface of this cultural heritage and how we coordinate this in together climate action and cultural heritage. And there are 3 examples. One is when we are building large projects, or we're developing large projects with governments in West Africa to protect coastal zones. And one specific example is in Ivory Coast and Ghana, where obviously the coast is under a lot of stress from coastal erosion, sea level rise, and other issues. And it has a very rich heritage because these are traditionally the zones where the settlements have been developed, where culture and life was really coming to fruition. So there through nature-based solutions, we're developing and protecting the coastline that then has positive impacts on protecting heritage, which is located on this coastline. And this is, I think, a very traditional way of coordinating climate action and heritage action. It is through climate adaptation also preserving cultural heritage sites, preserving livelihoods, preserving traditional ways of life on the coastline. In the second example, we're working in Mexico City, a very culturally rich city, in a very old neighborhood, to help that neighborhood rediscover its culture, its way of life, rediscover its ancient way of dealing with water scarcity and heat and the kind of increased heat. And this is by rediscovering the old networks of green and public spaces, of kind of exchange within the city, and really try to bring back the kind of culture and the kind of Mexican, Latin culture back to this neighborhood and revive it. So this is an urban generation in general with a very strong climate component. And of course, this is not only preserving the buildings, but it is preserving that kind of community culture in that neighborhood. Whether this is to regenerate green public spaces, to preserve water, preserve street life, bring back nature-based solutions to offer cooling and shading. So these are very concrete things that help protect this kind of neighborhood style. And then the last thing is we have, and just an example from the United Arab Emirates, it's not only the regeneration of existing cities or retrofitting, but also the urban population is growing very rapidly, so new developments are taking place day by day. And trying to work with governments and with cities to find solutions how to make these, how to learn from past ways cities have been built in these regions, and also trying to transform them with modern technology into the present day. And maybe you have all heard about Masdar City, this kind of sustainable neighborhood in Abu Dhabi, where they for the first time, and of course all this area is developing very rapidly with shiny high-rise buildings, glass towers and everything. And here Abu Dhabi has taken It's understanding that people were quite differently building cities back in the days, trying to learn from the culture of building Arab cities, narrow streets, neighborhoods for shading and cooling, trying to use traditional architectural techniques and transform them to modern buildings, to also bring back this kind of architectural culture back into the kind of Arab city building. So these are three, I think, different scales of how we are helping cities concretely coordinate the kind of climate action, urban sustainable development together with culture preservation and culture promotion. And these are, I think, just a snapshot of how we see value of this network enriching our work. And looking ahead, we of course joined this network because we believe in three great powers of this network to help us understand better with knowledge and evidence how we can, in our support to governments and cities, enrich our knowledge and evidence on how to bring back culture, bring together culture and climate action, to seek normative guidance and capacity building from the vast network and the experts around, to help answer concrete questions our partners have, and last but not least, of course, as we do here, advocacy and mobilization of actors, of bringing this culture more to the forefront of the international agenda. And again, our contribution to this network is this area of coordinating in a territorial way, territorial planning, urban planning, together with climate action and preservation of cultural heritage, and at the same time using culture, I believe, to promote climate resilient sustainable development, learning a little bit from past and proven recipes to develop our cities in a more climate resilient way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I said already that amplifying Indigenous voices is foregrounding the cultural dimension of climate action. And with that introduction, it's my pleasure to invite Janine Yazzie up to the podium. Janine is with the International Indian Treaty Council organization, and she is also the co-convener of the UN Indigenous Major Group for Sustainable Development. Janine?
I decided to leave my PowerPoint in my computer. Share Janine Yazzie and share Tima Janine Shlando Toda Chini Bashishchin. Nithana da Shiche, Zo Diskai da Shamila. Shemai Laura Lee Yazzie with Yashisha, Jackie Yazzie Jr. with Ya. Shike Deneta Ado Deshahon. Felt really important to start in that way. I had a youth at the action yesterday talk about how when we're participating in these spaces, we get so caught up in negotiation mood, we start acting and forgetting about how important ceremony and our cultural protocols are in these spaces. And this is an opportunity to not only bring that, but to also be able to highlight why that's so important. And I want to thank our sister for the beautiful introduction and the energy that she brought into the space, because it made it welcoming in that manner. So thank you. I want to share a little bit about myself and where I'm from. I'm from Deneta. Our colonized name is Navajo Nation, and it's in the southwest United States in occupied territories by the United States, known as Arizona and New Mexico. And it's always a reality I have to deal with, because everyone's always asking me what state I'm from. And I literally grow up on the intersection of several borders, and so it's always a difficult question to answer. So I often tell people I'm from the Rio Puerco region, because we're connected to our waters. The area that I'm from, I'm deeply connected to a mountain that is the end of a Chushka mountain territory, one of our sacred mountains. And it's sandstone and beautiful and majestic, and you don't really get to appreciate how important and how just majestic it is until you stand up right next to it and you place your hand on it and feel it emitting a cool breeze, because it holds water. That's the beauty of our sandstone. In the area that I grew up, I've gotten to experience each stage of my development in connection with that mountain, climbing and exploring and often doing dangerous things because it's very sheer. But in that process, I was always surrounded with the evidence of our people and our connection to that land, because there's all these petroglyphs and hidden spaces and corners. There are old food storage places. There are marks that show how our people used to manipulate the runoff from that mountain so that the runoff would go and feed important springs that my grandmothers were connected to, because that's where they would go to get their water, to wash the hair, to collect medicinal herbs. And one of the things that was always used to strike me growing up was that there used to be like this deer-like petroglyph, and I grew up not really seeing, but it had really long antlers. And I always used to be struck by that. And like, what is this animal? Because it was everywhere, and it showed us interacting with it, hunting it. And it wasn't until I started doing my climate change work and we started collecting oral stories from the families about how have they seen the ecology change, the landscape change, and how has that also led to these difficulties in maintaining our subsistence and traditional ways of living in our homeland. And it was in one community where an elder that was 96 years old started talking about the antelope, and how his family, his great-great-grandfather, used to tell him stories when he was growing up about how he saw the disappearance of the antelope and how important they were to our families, how they knew the names of the herds, and they knew and they could start to track in his generation that something was not quite right, that they were not coming back with as many children, they were not coming back at the same time scale during the same seasons. And they knew, and it was passed on to him, that things were going to be changing, and that in his lifetime, where he was going to have to remember the stories of the antelope and how they informed the families about when it was time to move, whether it was going to be a hard winter, what spring and summer was going to be like, and how connected they were to those families because they considered them a part of their clan, a part of their kinship. And it was only in this conversation that he was able to share the story and have it resonate and be documented in a way that informed us not only of the power and the importance of our oral histories and our connections to lands, but how long we have been tracking and maintaining the record of our climate changing. And the previous presentations, and I know this was not intended, but I felt like there was a lot of normalization that our culture is very much linked to the anthropogenic causes of climate change, right? And it's true. We're all part of this modern culture that feeds into that. But that's not how it started. Our cultures, indigenous peoples' cultures, did not contribute to what we're seeing now. And we can trace through our oral histories the beginning of these changes even prior to the Industrial Revolution, which is really the catalyst for a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in terms of greenhouse gases, to the onset of colonization of our lands and territories, and the unsatiable greed and desire for material resources, starting with the timber on the East Coast, and the beaver pelts of our northern territories and our First Nations communities. And we also experienced how that greed gets translated into warfare, with their experience of both the biological and the environmental warfare that was one of the major tools used throughout the Midwest and the spread of the westward expansion in the eradication of our buffalo herds. Buffalo that came all the way down to my territories, but now in a common modern American memory is only relegated to the plains in the north. It's been really interesting being here in Spain. This is my first visit to Spain, and having to carry these experiences, these histories, and the understanding of the situation that my people are in now and all indigenous peoples are in around the globe to the belly of what for our people in the Southwest was our first colonizer, the Spaniards and the conquistadors. And I bring that up because right now in the Southwest we're in a struggle for settling our water rights. And one of the things that we keep arguing is the importance of understanding our cultural heritage and bringing in this documentation and this data that showed how we took care of the landscape and how we utilized our water resources and stewarded them and maintained them for generations. So since 3000 BCE, before our Common Era, it was the Southwest indigenous peoples that harnessed dry land agricultural technologies and practices that brought life or brought agriculture to the desert. And we still have evidence of that. Yet in settling water rights, which is a very dry, technical, legal process that most people aren't interested in, but is very much the framework that is being used to determine our future claims to this precious resource in a desert area, the lawyers do not accept evidence like that to justify our water use, our claims for our waters. They only require, are limiting the definition of acceptable water usage to the areas that have irrigable soil based on a scientific framework that does not recognize dryland farming and the successes of it and the longevity of its success in our region. And it only looks at infrastructure that consists of pipelines and irrigation canals that are consistent with what Western society and Western culture values as a civilized use of this very precious resource. And the contradiction is that culture does not recognize that it's that very use and that disconnection of the relationship and the responsibility to maintaining those sacred sources of life that is at the very root of our overuse and our unsustainable connection to our water resources in the Southwest. And so our organization is so excited, the International Marine Treaty Council is so excited to be joining this effort because here we see for the first time people committed to understanding those nuances and all of those different aspects of culture, of heritage, of historical understanding, and of really deconstructing what we're dealing with in a holistic manner that matches what our lived experiences have been. Yeah, this issue about addressing climate grief is very real. And it's been long past time to draw upon indigenous peoples and the expertise and the scientific understanding that we have to help address this issue, because you won't find any other population that has more experience in preserving cultural heritage in the face of apocalyptic changes. And we're still here. We got lots of tips. Yes, the enormity of the tasks that we have at hand and the beautiful movement that we're seeing being created by youth around the globe, rising up to lead these conversations and to lead these movements, can't be taken for granted. We have a responsibility to not only restore our relationship to our environment, but to also understand how the different cultures have disproportionately contributed to the challenges and the development of institutions and practices and societies and communities and urban centers that feed this anthropogenic change. But that there are also other cultures with other pathways and other ways of living and other ways of designing development in communities that also address and meet our basic needs, that can contribute to what it looks like to truly build a sustainable future that is going to preserve our homelands, but also regenerate what was lost and reverse the damage that has been done. Because that is our responsibility for our future generations, not just for this youth generation or this young generation who's going to face enormous challenges as they come into adulthood, but for future generations that have not been born yet. Understanding the importance of cultural heritage and the role of indigenous peoples and local communities is to understand that climate change and the enormous issues that we face is not a call to unite to fight against a common enemy, right? That language, that conquest language, that warfare language is also very much the result of a cultural framework that has been embedded and normalized in our modern culture, and even in spaces like this with all our security restrictions and our limited access to the decision makers, right, under the guise of security, when we're all here to try to address this for the greater good. But we need to recognize that this is instead an opportunity to unite around a common purpose. And that purpose is to restore our connection to our world. And for indigenous peoples, that means to restore our connection to our lands, to our languages, to our cultural practices that even in the United States have been outlawed since the 1970s and are only now have been legalized for us to continue. And it also means to understand the role of colonization and the role of dominant religions in contributing to normalization of these cultural practices that underlie the foundation of the issue that we're dealing with. And as we work towards partnering and supporting the work plan of the facilitative working group, these are things that we can now bring to the forefront of this conversation, not as a way to create or further create divide. We've got enough of that going on, but as a way to build understanding and shared consciousness so that we can understand what that purpose means on an individual level, on a collective level, through our partnerships and our allyships, but also what it means for our global community and what pathways need to be created so that we can bring meaningful action to addressing this issue while also preserving the best of all of us, the best of all of our cultures, and create new practices that can honor that heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janine. It's now my pleasure to invite up to the podium our final speaker. When we launched the Climate Heritage Network and went to develop our action plan, we wanted to focus on concrete, practical steps that we could take to mobilize for climate action. We wanted to do that, though, through a far-flung, and as I think you've seen, diverse coalition embracing all geographies and all facets of the cultural movement. And so it's not a small order to combine those two things, an untested group of partners, a new collaboration, but urgent, fast, practical action. And so in casting about for someone with real-life experience with just that type of challenge, we immediately came to our final speaker, Yunus Erkan from Italy. Yunus has been a true leader in climate advocacy and climate action, and we have benefited enormously from our connection with him and, of course, with the organization he represents, ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, where he is the global head of advocacy. So for our final speaker, invite Yunus Erkan to the podium. Yunus?
Thanks, Andrew, for this very kind and warm welcome. It's really warm, by the way. It's really a great honor and true pride and joy to join this third step that I'm involved in my capacity as the International Steering Committee of the Climate Heritage Network. The journey that started at least from San Francisco, continued in Scotland, and now we are honored and we're all together proud of what we have delivered here. I'd like to provide a couple of insights in that, along the lines that Andrew shared with our contribution as ICLE to the process, I'd like to mention three issues. First of all, cities and local governments have been in the history much more longer than the nation states. So there are cities who have thousands of years of literally housing blocks or heritage that the current local governments are supposed to preserve and also still use this knowledge of living in harmony with their surroundings. So I think in that sense it's like a default partner of this process. I'm very happy our colleagues from UCLG are part of this process. I'm happy to hear other colleagues from CC35, I'm happy that it's part of this network. So local governments are one of the most closest administrations, public institutions, and we already have seen the examples from Scotland, from California, where they are part of this process. In this regard, ICLE, where we are taking the legacy of the 1992, the Earth Summit, the Local Agenda 21, citizen engagement has always been a core element, and we have noticed that, yes, as ICLE, our primary connection with the local governments, the traditional sustainability managers or environment managers, which do not necessarily always prioritize cultural elements. It's a fact, it's a reality. And what we are seeing that it is getting closer and closer. That is what we would probably bring to the table, how the sustainability managers of local governments could connect to their next door managers, which is the directors of culture, directors of other departments, so that they can use this power of cultural understanding of a new generation of sustainability action, and that's for me the best and the most important of this community now. Everything has its time. It's sometimes you really think about ahead and then it doesn't come up. But this climate heritage network really is this showing that the time has come, that it is not just preserving the past, but building a culture of sustainability. Because the new way of cities that Marcus has mentioned will not be just built by laws or just infrastructure. We have to reach to the minds and hearts of the people, and culture, arts, music is the best way to do that. And what we have also seen is one of the new examples. The more you reach to the citizens, the more you get their citizen engagement. Now, our Mayor of Bonn, who is hosting, City of Bonn, who is hosting ICLE Road Secretariat, is the president of our organization now. Next year is celebrating in his city the 250th anniversary of Beethoven, one of the most famous composers. The city will be fantastically celebrating this, but they have brought a new idea that Beethoven is well known with his peace and humanity, but there is also a famous cultural element, which is a pastoral performance, pastoral symphony. So the city is now reaching out to Earth Day Network, to ICLE, and all around the world to invite local governments to perform or be inspired by the performance of pastoral, which is peace with nature, peace with human, so that from Earth Day, 50th anniversary, 22nd of April to 5th of June, we will bring this mobilization at the time when we need NDCs to be more ambitious and more actively more with the citizens and local governments, so that this will be used as a leverage to act. And last point, as ICLE's contribution into this process, I'm acting as the focal point of local governments and municipal authorities constituency, which is one of the 9 major groups. And this is a new family. It's a diverse family. It doesn't look like any of those traditional communities. So we will be very happy to connect this community, which we are very proud to be part of, to other elements of the UNFCCC process, in particular climate action, global climate action, but also the ACE, Action for Climate Empowerment, which is education, awareness, public awareness. These are the elements that this community can really bring a lot of value. And then on the way to Glasgow, and that will be my last point, we discussed in Edinburgh, we want to make the COP in Glasgow a COP of multi-level action. And yesterday, Mayor of Glasgow was here. Next a couple of days, we will have the Cabinet Secretary as well from Scotland coming on environment. So, on the way to Milan and on the way to Glasgow, you have seen here a lot of ministers from energy, transport, hardcore, challenging, and that these are the community that we have to change. Yes, true, but we are not. This should not be us and them. We would like to bring ministers of culture, ministers of education, ministers of youth, ministers of science, and ministers of family, so that in Milan at COP26 and in Glasgow, they could be sitting in this tables with their peers, the other ministers, including ministers of urbanization as well, that part of this community, so that they tell that a new world is being built, a new mobilization of action is coming, and that a lot of governmental institutions who are part of it, the other ministers should not be afraid, should not be worried, so that we take to a new level of this next 10 years. This next 10 years is critical. It will be built in Glasgow, but if we want to be successful in Glasgow, we have to work from today onwards. Throughout the year, we will be happy to contribute to the roadmap. In June, there will be special, during the climate conference, a discussion on arts, music, and culture, and I'm working with Andrew and all the other partners that, especially on this day, how we can use this as a stepping stone to Glasgow. These are my contributions, and I'm congratulating all the network partners with this impressive roadmap. You and we, I'm feeling myself as part of it, we are bringing new energy to this halls. So I think this is time to celebrate, and this is time to be proud. This time now to diffuse into other halls throughout the next 10 years, so that they hear us, they work with us, and we bring this action and this transformation, not necessarily from the minds, but from the heart and from the conscience of people and communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yeddi. That's fantastic. Summing up. We have 1 minute before we have to leave, so unfortunately we do not have time for panel discussion. I think the best thing is, in the remaining minute, I'm going to invite Andrew up just to say a few words, just to conclude the session. And I'd like to remind you, do get in touch with us, climateheritage.org. We have a booth 19 in Hall 4. It's the first booth beside the coffee, you can't miss us. Please come along and say hi. Andrew.
I'm going to split my minute. I'm going to spend 30 seconds thanking some folks, and I'm going to spend 30 seconds, and this is a bit of a surprise, inviting Ambassador Lupa from Greece to let you know about a follow-up session later in the COP that also touches on cultural heritage. But first I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank you for attending. I particularly want to thank the United Kingdom Pavilion for hosting us. We've been thrilled to have members of the network from China, from Ecuador, from Thailand, from across the globe, but a consistent partner has been the United Kingdom government and the government of Scotland, and it's been a fruitful partnership, and we appreciate you hosting us. And now, just to conclude, I'd like to ask Ambassador Lupa to tell you about another program that will continue this topic next week. Ambassador Lupa from Greece.
Thank you, Andrew. It will be very nice to have you as moderator to our side event on the 10th. We are organizing from 12:30 to 2 o'clock on the European Union Pavilion, a side event concerning the initiative that Greece presented on during a climate summit. This initiative started almost a year ago. In June, we convened in Greece a scientific conference with participation from 43 countries concerning the protection of cultural heritage from climate change impact. The conclusions of this conference have been included to a proposal that has been presented in our proposal during the summit, as I mentioned. And till now we have the support from 78 even more countries and from 4 international organizations. I mean UN, UNESCO, WMO and the Council of Europe. This proposal has been presented with the above mentioned international organizations And in the side event in New York, we had Professor Dallas, who is the Secretary General of the WMO. From UNESCO was the Director General for Science, Mrs. Beduel. Of course, the Ministry of Culture of Greece and the Ministry of Environment of Greece, as well as Professor Sachs from UN Sustainable Development, and several NGOs like ICOMOS, Europa Nostra. We believe that we have to preserve our past, our heritage, never mind if it is natural or cultural, if it is tangible or intangible. We have to act, and for that reason we would like you to be present in our side event in order to have the follow-up from September and to be with us. Thank you very much. Congratulations for whatever you are doing. Everything is great. Let's hope that something will come out from all these actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lupa. And the presence here next week of the Greek Minister of Culture, Madam Mendoni, is, I think, a down payment on Eunice's proposal for a ministerial round on culture in Glasgow. And so with that, I leave you with the parting thought. Climate change is a culture issue. Culture is a climate issue. Join us in the mobilization of arts, culture, and heritage for climate action. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.